Hello and welcome to another episode of War Thunder with your host, Czar Peppers. I guess with the last episode and today's episode, we're just going full Anglophile because War Thunder have finally introduced the first tanks of the British tank line with 4 premium tanks that you can buy right now. I think they're also bundled with some premium time, so that's another little perk. The tanks you'll be able to purchase are the A13 Cruiser Mark II, the one we'll be looking at today, the M10 Achilles with the 17-pounder, the Sherman Firefly with the 17-pounder, and my favorite, the Black Prince with the, you guessed it, 17-pounder. However, with the exception of the Cruiser at a price of $16 Canadian, or American, I don't remember what it was, the rest are going to set you back an amount that seems rather large for a digital vehicle, but then again, at this point you can sort of think of it more as providing money to support the creation of the game, sort of a donation with a perk. But it's really up to the individual regarding how much they're willing to spend on this kind of thing. But I thought I would splurge and get the A13 Cruiser Mark II, as it's an underdog tank that I've been quite fond of since playing World of Tanks. I did do a video for World Tanks that included some information on the A13 Cruiser. Actually, it may not have been the A13, may have been the A10. Anyways, but this time I thought I would focus more on the in-game performance of the A13, but there will also be some historical goodies scattered throughout as well. They've done a great job on this graphically. I mean, compared to the cruisers in World of Tanks, this thing is on a whole another level, as everything in War Thunder is generally graphically. But this is a new game, so you can't really fault World of Tanks for that, because it's getting on in age now, and although they have made HD texture improvements, it's, still never going to be as beautiful as War Thunder is. This is a tier 1 tank, where it belongs, although I imagine it wouldn't be entirely hopeless against tier 2 tanks, but it would definitely be a challenge. I'm pretty impressed with the 40mm anti-tank gun on it. It can deal with lightly armored early tanks without much fuss. They have 2 choices of armor-piercing ammunition, both with reasonable penetration values, but if you're trying to penetrate armor that's 30 to 50mm thick, you aren't going to want to be much more than 500 yards away, or meters, I don't remember what it is in game. The A13 has some improvements over the earlier A9 and A10 models. The turret has some added spaced armor on the sides, but overall the thickness is still pretty thin. The hull of the A13 doesn't have any improvements, and it's going to be your primary weak spot when engaging somebody head-on. You don't really want to get shot at much in this thing. Taking out your opponent with that 2-pounder before they have a chance to shoot back at you is going to be your best bet for survival, so it's important to know your opposing tanks by studying the X-ray view of them in the garage. That way you'll get the most out of that first shot by hitting their ammunition or something important, or a good spot to take out their entire crew. Your armor is as little as 15mm thick on parts of your tank, more like armor you'd see on a Bren gun carrier rather than a tank. That's why your first shot is so important. Now, for some background, during the interwar period, the British developed a tank doctrine that involved 2 different classes of tanks. The infantry tanks, slow tanks that would move up alongside the infantry to support them in their advance, and cruiser tanks, fast tanks that were meant to exploit breakthroughs in the enemy lines. Many saw them as inheriting the role of the cavalry. In the last episode of Armored Warfare we took a look at the Chieftain, the last British tank considered to take on the role of the cruiser tank. So you can think of the cruiser as the Chieftain's earliest ancestor. Although by that point the requirements of a cruiser tank had morphed significantly from the original concept, taking on a form of what we would now call a main battle tank these days. The cruiser had a suspension system based on the Christie design. After a number of people representing the British armor industry saw some demonstrations of the Soviet BT line of tanks that used a borrowed version of the same suspension system, they went back to Britain and recommended a tank be designed using the same suspension system. With this design, each road wheel had its own independent suspension, allowing all the wheels to move independently of each other. This gave tanks based on the design an impressive speed over rough ground, and later the legendary T-34 would use the same suspension system in its design. At first the system had been designed for use with and without tracks on the road wheels, but this idea was ditched by the British and the Soviets pretty early on. But despite the Christie suspension, the Cruiser Mark II wasn't as quick as the BT-7, as the BT-7 is 13.9 tons, whereas the Cruiser is 14.3, and the Cruiser had 340 horsepower petrol V12, while the BT-7 had a V12 with 450 horsepower. But that said, the Cruiser will still outpace most of its contemporaries. Now, on to firepower. The gun on the A13 was the 40mm QF 2-pounder, that's 40mm, a fairly effective gun among its contemporaries. When compared to the 45mm gun on the BT-7, it makes up for the lesser caliber with a higher velocity of 852 meters per second, 100 more than the 45. You can also expect to get an average of 10 more millimeters of penetration with the A13's 40mm gun compared to the Soviet 45. The American 37mm anti-tank gun comes out slightly ahead of the 2-pounder in velocity and penetration. The German 50mm anti-tank gun's standard ammunition has a velocity of 685 millimeters per second, and penetration values around 5 to 10 millimeters less than the 2-pounder. However, the upgraded ammunition for the 50mm will blow the 2-pounder out of the water. In RL, that's real life, the A13 was quick, but under-armored and unreliable, something unsurprising from a subsidiary of Morris Motors. After all, they did make the Morris Marina. Most of these cruisers of the 1st Armoured Division with the British Expeditionary Force in France were destroyed or abandoned during the fall of France and the ensuing evacuation from Dunkirk. A number of them were also used in Greece and in Libya, where they actually stood a chance against the more antiquated Italian designs, until the Germans arrived anyways. Although I have to note that I did find some conflicting accounts in regards to its reliability. It is possible they ironed out many of the issues with the Mark II when they made the Mark IV, the only one to really see combat. Now I wanted to give you guys a quick look at the various armor thicknesses on this vehicle. Now taking a look at the front, this is probably the thickest part at 30-ish millimeters. Down here is extremely thin at only 14 millimeters. Up here is more of the same, very thin armor, like you'd see on a Bren gun carrier or something. Looking down at the top, you can see the spaced armor on the sides. 3 plates on each side at 14 millimeters, plus another 14 millimeters, giving you decent protection from the side of the turret. And then the side of the hull is only 7 millimeters thick. Yeah, you gotta be careful in this thing. So, other than being awesome merely for being British, what do I think of this little guy? I'm not going to pretend that it doesn't have glaring problems. In-game, as it did in real life, the armor is extremely thin, and when looking at the big picture, the gun is pretty weak. And even though it is fast, it is far from the fastest. But that's the thing, I always enjoy trying to make the underdog work, and I believe that in this game, at least, you can. It takes a little while to get used to maneuvering this thing around at speed. But once I got used to it, I could throw this thing around the battlefield with ease, easily being able to turn around obstacles while maintaining speed at the same time. That isn't the case for making stationary turns though. The hull has an extremely slow traverse rate, and unlike some other tanks, reversing while turning doesn't improve that traverse rate at all. I highly recommend angling as you usually do. You can get a decent amount of protection from that thin armor if angled correctly, at least from smaller caliber rounds, but it is pretty hard. The turret has some weird angles to it that present very obvious flat surfaces, it seems like, no matter how you position the tank. In real life, one of the big weaknesses of the 2-pounder on it was its lack of high explosive ammunition for soft targets. There were HE shells available, but they rarely had them in the field. You do get HE in the game, but I wouldn't imagine it is very effective, maybe against anti-aircraft stuff and the like. But I really like the gun. It may not be the best gun when looking at the stats, but I like its high velocity shells and I love its fast reload rate. All in all, it's probably one of my favorite tier 1 tanks. Armor leaves much to be desired, but if that gun is used effectively with the tank's speed, you can be an effective asset for your team. It is actually similar to the Stuart in many ways. Sort of the same armor, while the Stuart has a bit more or less same caliber gun and penetration. One time I was looking at my stats for the tank that I had the most kills in, and to my surprise, it was the M3 Stuart that I had by far the most. So if the A13 Cruiser is anything like that, I'm sure I'm going to have plenty of fun in it. However, I have had a few of those games in this thing where just everything goes wrong. And I find those happen from time to time in this thing. So it is really a thinking person's tank. If you're a brute force kind of guy, you're probably going to get pretty frustrated by it. If you've stuck around this long, I would appreciate it if you gave me a like or a dislike. But since you're still here, I thought I'd give you a few demonstrations of the penetration ability of this tank, the 2-pounder on it. Here we have a Panzer IIc. Won't be much of an issue. Complete. So as we can see, not much of an issue dealing with that. Now we have a Panzer IV, and an early model. We'll see how this goes. Oh, it hit at a bad angle. I find the accuracy is a bit weird on this gun. There we go, that was a decent hit. Aim for the viewport, and there we go, gone. So as you can see, you can use this thing to take out higher tier targets. So you're not completely helpless as you can sometimes be. Now let's see what happens when I do this. Oh. Let's try that again. Wow, not bad. Took out a Panther with a Cruiser. And if you're wondering if I could take out the Tiger, well, no. I couldn't at all. So stop wondering. So that's the A13 Cruiser. I'm not going to recommend or not recommend it, because it is really up to the individual whether or not they want it or not. But if you are looking at this thing and your heart is telling you, I want that, then yes, I would go ahead and get it. It will fulfill your desire of wantiness. Temporarily anyways. So until next time, thanks for watching. Hello and welcome to another episode of I Pooped My Pants.